The Harris County Courthouse in Texas stood tall and imposing, its grand architecture a symbol of justice and order. The morning sun poured through the tall windows, casting golden streaks across the polished wooden benches. Inside Courtroom 4B, the air was thick with tension, a mix of hope and weariness etched on the faces of those waiting for their turn. Presiding over it all was Judge Albert Greer, a man whose stern expression and reputation for no-nonsense rulings were legendary. His booming voice and swift judgments had earned him respect from some and disdain from others, depending on which side of the law they stood. The clerk's voice echoed through the room, announcing the next case. Case 5321, Michelle Carter. Minor traffic violation. Michelle stepped forward. A black woman in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp navy suit that spoke of professionalism and poise. Her presence was calm, almost regal, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of frustration. She stood out in this courtroom, where most defendants shuffled in nervously, unprepared for the weight of the law. Michelle, however, carried herself with a quiet confidence, her sharp gaze scanning the room as if she were no stranger to scrutiny. Judge Greer didn't look up immediately. He flipped through the file before him, his voice steady but cold. "Miss Carter," he began, still avoiding eye contact. "You've been charged with failure to signal a lane change. Do you contest this?" Michelle took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Your Honor, I would like to clarify." But Greer cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "This is not a debate, Miss Carter. This is a courtroom, not a platform for excuses. Do you contest the charge or not?" A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, a subtle reminder of the tension in the room. Michelle's jaw tightened for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "No, Your Honor," she replied evenly. Greer leaned back in his chair, his eyes finally meeting hers. They lingered, assessing, searching, as if trying to unravel something beneath her calm exterior. Then, with a tone that left no room for argument, he delivered his ruling. "Then I see no reason for leniency. You are fined $1,000, payable within 30 days. Next case." The gavel struck like a thunderclap, silencing the room. Michelle turned and walked away, her head held high, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning. Michelle's calm demeanor never wavered, though a flicker of disappointment briefly crossed her face. She thanked Judge Greer with a polite nod and turned to leave the courtroom. As she walked past the bench, Greer's gaze lingered on her. There was something about her that unsettled him. Not guilt or defiance, but something he couldn't quite place. He brushed the thought aside and moved on to the next case, his voice ringing out once more. Yet, even as the courtroom buzzed with activity, something about Michelle Carter lingered in the air, like a story half told. Michelle walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. The fine was steep, unnecessarily so, but her expression gave nothing away. Outside, the courthouse hummed with the chatter of lawyers, defendants, and court staff. Curious glances followed her, but she moved with quiet purpose, ignoring them all. The parking lot was a mix of chaos and monotony, cars pulling in, others reversing out, a bailiff shouting for someone to move their vehicle. Michelle reached her car, a sleek black sedan that hinted at her professional success. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, her fingers drumming softly against the steering wheel. She didn't sigh or shake her head. She simply sat there, her thoughts unreadable. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Greer was already halfway through another case. His mind was focused on the parade of defendants before him, but occasionally his thoughts drifted back to Michelle Carter. Her poise had been unsettling, not defiant, but composed in a way that suggested she wasn't just another name in a docket. He dismissed the thought each time it surfaced, chalking it up to overthinking. "Focus, Greer," he muttered under his breath, shifting his attention back to the case at hand. The hours dragged on, and by midday, the courtroom's energy had dulled into monotony. Greer called for a recess and retreated to his chambers to review the next set of cases. He poured himself a cup of coffee and glanced at the stack of files on his desk. Among them was a high-profile case he'd been assigned to preside over, a white-collar criminal trial involving corporate embezzlement. It was one of the most anticipated cases of the year, drawing attention from media outlets and legal professionals alike. As he skimmed through the details, his mind briefly wandered again to Michelle Carter. What was it about her that he couldn't shake? There was a knock at the door. Greer's clerk, a young man fresh out of law school, poked his head in. "Your Honor, the lead prosecutor for the Montgomery case is here. She's asked for a moment of your time." Greer frowned. It wasn't unusual for prosecutors to request meetings, but he preferred to keep interactions brief and strictly professional. He nodded and stood, smoothing the front of his robe. When he stepped out of his chambers, his breath caught for a moment. Standing there, clipboard in hand, was Michelle Carter. She wasn't in the navy suit anymore. Instead, she wore a sharp, black blazer and a pristine white blouse, the kind of attire that commanded attention without saying a word. Her nameplate badge glinted under the fluorescent lights. Michelle Carter, Chief Prosecutor. Greer's face remained composed, but his mind raced. He realized with a jolt of embarrassment that he hadn't looked closely at the docket earlier that morning. He hadn't seen her credentials, hadn't even considered the possibility that the defendant in his courtroom was anything more than what her case file suggested. Michelle extended her hand, her expression neutral, but tinged with polite professionalism. "Good afternoon, Your Honor. I'm Michelle Carter, Chief Prosecutor on the Montgomery case." Greer took her hand after a beat, his grip firm but hesitant. "Miss Carter," he replied, his voice carefully measured. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." Her lips curved into a faint, polite smile. "Life's full of surprises, isn't it?" And with that, the power dynamics shifted, leaving Judge Greer to confront the growing unease stirring within him. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the Montgomery case began. Journalists lined the back rows, their pens poised, cameras occasionally flashing despite strict warnings. This was the trial everyone had been talking about for weeks, a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scandal implicating one of the city's wealthiest CEOs. The stakes were sky high and the spotlight was glaring. Judge Greer entered the courtroom with his usual stern demeanor, the sound of the gavel silencing the chatter. But as he glanced at the prosecution's table, he found his focus wavering. There sat Michelle Carter, now commanding the room with the same composure she'd shown that morning, only this time with the authority of her title on full display. She was calm but deliberate as she adjusted her papers, her team whispering final notes to her before the opening arguments began. Greer's gaze lingered a moment longer than it should have. He felt a nagging sense of unease, a reminder of the morning's encounter. Michelle Carter wasn't just another prosecutor. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd underestimated her. The unease gnawing at Judge Greer wasn't because of anything Michelle had done. It was because of what he had failed to do. His own actions from earlier that morning replayed in his mind. The fine, his tone, the dismissive wave of his hand. He had treated her with the same casual disregard he reserved for those he assumed were beneath him. And now, here she was, commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom, a force to be reckoned with. "Your Honor," the clerk prompted, breaking his train of thought. The trial was about to begin. Michelle stood, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about betrayal. It's about trust, and what happens when the very people we entrust with our livelihoods abuse that trust for personal gain." Her words were precise, cutting, and deliberate. She painted a vivid picture of the defendant's greed, laying out the evidence with surgical precision. The jury hung on her every word. Even the defense counsel, seasoned as they were, looked momentarily unsettled. Greer watched her work, his mind split between the trial and the growing realization of his own shortcomings. He'd spent years on the bench, priding himself on his impartiality. Yet, he had judged Michelle Carter long before she'd had a chance to speak in his courtroom. The prosecution's argument continued, with Michelle leading the charge like a conductor guiding an orchestra. She was methodical, laying out each piece of evidence as though it were a carefully placed domino in a chain reaction. The jury seemed captivated, leaning forward in their seats as her narrative unfolded. When the court broke for lunch, Greer retreated to his chambers, his thoughts heavy. He had always viewed himself as a gatekeeper of justice, someone who upheld the law without bias, but today had shown him the cracks in his own armor. Back in the courtroom, Michelle remained composed, reviewing her notes and discussing strategy with her team. There was no outward sign that she harbored any resentment toward Greer, but her poise only deepened his discomfort. It wasn't anger or defiance he saw in her. It was something much more unsettling. Grace. As the trial pressed on, Judge Greer couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was no coincidence, but rather a reckoning long overdue. The afternoon, session resumed, and the courtroom fell into a tense rhythm. Michelle Carter continued to command the prosecution's case with precision and confidence. Her arguments cut through the defense's attempts to sow doubt. The air seemed heavier, now, as if the weight of unspoken truths hung above the proceedings. Judge Greer observed her intently, his earlier assumptions crumbling under the weight of her professionalism and poise. Judge Greer couldn't ignore how effortlessly Michelle controlled the room. Her questions during cross-examinations were razor-sharp, her tone unwavering. The jury was captivated, and even the defense attorney, a seasoned litigator, struggled to keep pace. The defendant, a man in his late 50s with a carefully groomed appearance, looked increasingly uncomfortable under Michelle's line of questioning. She highlighted inconsistencies in his statements, each one landing with the precision of a hammer on a nail. The gallery murmured as her case built momentum piece by piece. At one point, Greer found himself leaning forward slightly, his attention more invested than he cared to admit. He caught himself and leaned back, gripping the armrests of his chair. He was supposed to be impartial, but something about this trial, and about Michelle, made it personal. During a brief recess, Greer found himself standing near the water cooler, lost in thought. He hadn't heard Michelle approach until her voice interrupted his reverie. "Your Honor," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I wanted to thank you for keeping the proceedings efficient today." Greer turned, meeting her gaze. There was no trace of mockery or sarcasm in her expression, just professionalism. Yet her words felt like a subtle challenge, a reminder of their earlier interaction. "You're running a tight case, Miss Carter," he replied, careful to keep his tone neutral. "The jury seems to be following your arguments closely." She nodded, but didn't break eye contact. "Justice matters, Your Honor. Every detail counts." Her words lingered, even after she walked away. Greer returned to his chambers, closing the door behind him. He sat at his desk, staring at the stack of papers, but not really seeing them. He'd been on the bench for decades, and in all those years, he'd prided himself on his ability to spot the truth beneath the surface. Yet, he had failed to see Michelle Carter for who she truly was. The thought gnawed at him. It wasn't just about Michelle. It was about all the times he might have judged too quickly, the moments where his assumptions might have colored his decisions. He'd always told himself he was fair, but now that belief felt shakier than ever. When the trial resumed, Greer's demeanor had shifted subtly. He was still firm, still commanding, but there was a new deliberateness in his actions. He listened more closely, watched more intently. And as Michelle continued her questioning, he found himself not just observing the case, but also re-evaluating his own role in the pursuit of justice. Judge Greer found himself not just watching Michelle, but learning from her. Her precision, her calm authority, and her unwavering focus on justice were unlike anything he'd seen in his years on the bench. Yet, even as the case drew closer to its conclusion, the unease in his chest grew. It wasn't just about the trial, anymore. It was about him. Michelle's presence forced him to confront not just his biases, but the very principles he thought defined him. The courtroom was silent, save for the steady rhythm of Michelle Carter's voice as she delivered her closing arguments. Her words were powerful, deliberate, and unyielding, painting a vivid picture of greed, betrayal, and accountability. The jury hung on her every word, their expressions a mixture of contemplation and conviction. Judge Greer listened too, though his focus wavered. He wasn't just hearing the prosecutor's argument. He was reflecting on his own actions, his judgments, and the moments he had failed to live up to the standards he thought he upheld. When Michelle finished, she sat down, with a quiet confidence, the weight of her words still echoing in the room. The defense gave their closing statements, but they lacked the same clarity and impact. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom which side had presented the stronger case. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, and the courtroom emptied out for the recess. As Greer retreated to his chambers, he found himself dreading the solitude. His thoughts were louder than ever, demanding his attention. A knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. It was Michelle. "Your Honor," she said, standing in the doorway with her hands clasped in front of her. "Do you have a moment?" Greer gestured for her to enter, though he wasn't sure he was ready for this conversation. She stepped inside, her demeanor calm but resolute. "I wanted to address what happened earlier today," Michelle began, her voice steady. "I'm not here to challenge your ruling. I understand the courtroom is your domain, but I believe it's important to recognize when moments like this reveal something deeper." Greer's jaw tightened slightly, though he stayed silent. She wasn't accusing him outright, but her words carried weight. "When I stood in your courtroom this morning," she continued, "I wasn't just a name on a docket, and I know you've likely presided over hundreds of cases like mine, but every one of those names, Your Honor, belongs to someone with a story, someone who deserves to be seen for more than just the charges against them." Her words hit harder than any rebuke could have. Greer felt the weight of them settle into his chest, heavy and inescapable. He opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, the gravity of her words leaving him momentarily speechless. Judge Greer hesitated, unsure of what he could say to make it right. Michelle broke the silence, her tone softening. "I'm not looking for an apology," she said. "I just hope that the next time someone stands before you, you'll take a moment to see the person, not just the case." Greer nodded slowly, his voice finally finding its way out. "You're right, Miss Carter. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment this morning, and that's on me. It's something I need to work on." There was a pause, brief but significant. Michelle seemed satisfied, though not vindicated. This wasn't about winning for her. It was about making a point. That mattered. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply. "I appreciate your willingness to reflect." She turned to leave, but before stepping out, she paused. "And for what it's worth," she added, "I'm confident the jury will make the right decision." As the door closed behind her, Greer leaned back in his chair, exhaling a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding. Her words stayed with him, not as a reprimand, but as a challenge, a call to do better. And as the gavel was set to fall on the Montgomery case, Judge Greer knew that this trial had already changed one life, his own. The courtroom reconvened as the jury filed back in, their expressions stoic but purposeful. The gallery sat intense, silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Michelle Carter sat at the prosecution's table, her face calm but focused, a quiet confidence radiating from her. Judge Greer took his seat at the bench, his gavel poised but not yet raised. His eyes swept over the room before finally landing on Michelle. For a moment, he wondered if she felt the same tension he did, but her composure gave nothing away. "Members of the jury," Greer said, his voice steady though his thoughts churned beneath the surface. "Have you reached a verdict?" The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer, rose from her seat, holding the folded paper that would seal the defendant's fate. The courtroom held its collective breath as she unfolded it. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts," she declared, her voice clear and resolute. The gallery erupted into murmurs, but a sharp rap of Greer's gavel silenced them. The defendant slumped in his chair, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking. The weight of justice had landed squarely on his shoulders. Michelle exchanged brief nods with her team, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. The case was over. But the impact of the trial and the lessons it carried would linger far beyond the courtroom. There were no cheers or outward displays of triumph for Michelle. For her, this wasn't about personal victory. It was about the principle. She began gathering her papers as the defendant was led away in handcuffs, the media's cameras clicking furiously in the background. Greer dismissed the jury and adjourned the court for the day. As the room emptied, he found himself lingering at the bench, watching as Michelle prepared to leave. She paused at the door, her gaze meeting his one final time. There was no animosity in her eyes, only a quiet understanding. She nodded, acknowledging not just the case, but the unspoken shift between them. That evening, Greer sat alone in his chambers, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He thought about the Montgomery case, the evidence, the arguments. But mostly, he thought about Michelle Carter. Her words, her poise, her ability to hold her ground without resorting to anger or confrontation. For years, he had believed himself to be an arbiter of fairness, someone who upheld justice without bias, but today had shown him the subtle ways prejudice could seep into even the most well-intentioned judgments. It wasn't a comfortable realization, but it was a necessary one. The sound of his desk phone broke his reverie. It was his clerk reminding him of the schedule for the next day. Greer thanked him and hung up, then leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Justice wasn't just about verdicts and sentences. It was about the people who stood before the bench, each with their own story, their own struggles. Michelle, Carter had reminded him of that in a way he would never forget. As the courthouse emptied for the night, Judge Greer resolved to carry that lesson with him, not just into his courtroom, but into every decision he made moving forward. This story is a powerful reminder of how assumptions can blind us to the truth, and how even those in positions of authority are not immune to the biases they may carry. Judge Greer's journey is one of reflection and growth, and it challenges all of us to examine our own actions and judgments. Let's take this opportunity to reflect on our own lives. Are we truly seeing people for who they are, or are we letting assumptions guide our decisions? Justice, fairness, and empathy begin with awareness. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Let's continue the conversation about the power of understanding and change. Together we can make a difference.